Seth's birth marked a pivotal moment in human history, a beacon of hope in a world overshadowed by tragedy and loss. After Cain, in a fit of jealous rage, murdered his brother Abel, Adam and Eve were left devastated. The brutal act not only robbed them of a beloved son, but also shattered their vision of the future. Abel had embodied their hope for righteousness, a reflection of the goodness they longed to restore after their expulsion from Eden. With Abel gone and Cain banished, they must have wondered if the darkness creeping into their family would consume future generations. Would the promise of God still stand, or had sin completely derailed his plan? Yet, in the midst of their grief, a new light emerged: Seth. His name, meaning appointed, was more than just a name. It was a declaration of divine purpose. To Adam and Eve, Seth was not merely a replacement for Abel. He was living proof that God's plan was still unfolding, that his promises endured despite human failure. Seth's birth signified a second chance, a reminder that even in brokenness, God could bring restoration. Through him, Adam and Eve saw the opportunity to continue their sacred mission, to nurture a lineage that would remain faithful to the Creator. Unlike Cain, who chose a path of self-reliance and rebellion, Seth was raised with a deep awareness of the consequences of sin and the importance of obedience. Adam and Eve, seasoned by the bitter lessons of their past, poured their wisdom into him. They likely told him about their time in Eden, their close walks with God, and the painful moment they had to leave paradise. They would have recounted the tragic story of Abel's murder, warning him of the dangers of jealousy and pride. Most importantly, they would have shared the divine promise God had given them that one day, the offspring of the woman would crush the serpent's head. This prophecy, found in Genesis 3:15, was not just a distant hope. It became the guiding principle of Seth's life. He understood that his existence was part of something far greater than himself. He wasn't just another son. He was a key figure in God's unfolding redemptive plan. Through Seth, the spiritual foundation of humanity was renewed. His birth restored what had been lost, rekindling the hope of our righteous lineage that would seek to walk in faithfulness with God. Seth's arrival was not simply about filling the void left by Abel's death. It was about continuing the divine narrative of redemption. His life was a testament to God's faithfulness, a reminder that, no matter how dark the world seemed, his plan for salvation would always prevail. The contrast between the descendants of Seth and Cain is one of the most striking themes in early biblical history, representing the ongoing struggle between righteousness and sin. After Cain murdered Abel and was cast away, he chose to distance himself further from God, building a life based on self-reliance, ambition, and personal achievement rather than faith. Cain's descendants became pioneers of civilization, establishing cities, advancing in technology, and cultivating the arts. However, despite their progress, they moved further away from God, embracing lives of pride, violence, and moral corruption. Their pursuit of worldly success led them to reject God's authority, favoring their own desires over divine wisdom. Seth's lineage, on the other hand, followed a drastically different path. Unlike Cain's descendants, who sought fulfillment through human innovation and personal gain, Seth's family dedicated themselves to preserving faith in God. They understood that true success was not measured by earthly accomplishments, but by their devotion to the Creator. Through Seth, Adam and Eve's teachings were passed down, ensuring that the knowledge of God and His promise of redemption would not be lost. His family embraced humility and righteousness, standing apart from a world that was becoming increasingly corrupt. One of the most defining moments in Seth's lineage came during his lifetime, as Genesis 4:26 states. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This simple yet profound statement highlights the impact of Seth and his descendants. While Cain's lineage built cities and pursued power, Seth's family sought something far greater: a relationship with God. They recognized the importance of worship and obedience, coming together in faith to honor the Creator. This marked the first recorded instance of organized worship in human history, a spiritual revival that distinguished Seth's family from the rest of the world. Cain's descendants, however, continued to drift further from God. As generations passed, they became increasingly consumed by greed, arrogance, and moral decay. The biblical account of Lamech, a descendant of Cain, paints a stark picture of this decline. He openly boasted about murder and introduced polygamy, a sign of growing disregard for God's design. The contrast between the two family lines became even clearer. While Cain's descendants glorified themselves, Seth's family glorified God. This division between the two lineages symbolizes the fundamental choice all humanity faces to follow the ways of the world or to walk in faithfulness with God. Seth's family represents the enduring presence of righteousness, proving that even in the midst of corruption, those who remain devoted to God will always have a place in His plan. The spiritual revival that began during Seth's time marked a crucial turning point in human history. Genesis 4:26 states, "At that time people began to call on the name of the Lord." This verse signifies more than just a moment of worship. It represents the reawakening of humanity's connection with God after a period of darkness and moral decline. Through Seth and his descendants, a renewed dedication to seeking God and honoring His presence was established, setting them apart from the rebellious lineage of Cain. While Cain's descendants focused on personal ambition, earthly advancements, and self-glorification, Seth's family understood the importance of faith and spiritual integrity. The phrase "calling on the name of the Lord" suggests a public and collective movement of worship. Unlike private prayers or individual acts of devotion, this was a conscious effort to gather as a community and acknowledge God's sovereignty. It was the first recorded instance of organized worship, a tradition that would continue throughout biblical history and shape the identity of God's chosen people. Seth and his descendants were not merely passive believers. They were spiritual leaders, guiding others to seek God in a world that was growing increasingly hostile to righteousness. This revival was essential in preserving the knowledge of God. After the fall of Adam and Eve and the devastating loss of Abel, humanity faced the real danger of drifting completely away from the Creator. Cain's descendants pursued a life separate from God, developing cities and cultures that prioritized personal gain over divine obedience. Without an intentional effort to keep God at the center of their lives, Seth's lineage could have easily been influenced by these surrounding temptations. However, by prioritizing worship and passing down the teachings of faith, they maintained their distinction as a people devoted to God. The significance of this movement extended beyond Seth's generation. By establishing a culture of calling upon God, Seth's descendants created a spiritual foundation that would influence future generations, leading to figures like Enoch, Methuselah, and Noah. Their faithfulness ensured that despite the world's growing corruption, there would always be a remnant of people who remained true to God's promises. This moment in history serves as a powerful reminder that faith is not something inherited passively. It must be actively lived out and nurtured. Seth's leadership in reviving true worship calls believers today to reflect on their own spiritual commitment. Are we calling on the name of the Lord in our daily lives? Are we setting an example for others to follow? Just as Seth's revival preserved the knowledge of God in an increasingly sinful world, our faithfulness today can have a lasting impact on future generations. Seth's lineage played a crucial role in preserving God's divine plan for redemption, serving as the foundation upon which His covenant would unfold. Unlike Cain's descendants, who pursued worldly success and personal ambition, Seth's family remained faithful to God, passing down His teachings and ensuring that the promise of salvation was never forgotten. Through this righteous lineage, key figures emerged, individuals who would carry forward the spiritual legacy necessary to prepare the way for the fulfillment of God's ultimate plan. One of the most notable descendants of Seth was Enoch, a man who walked so closely with God that he was taken directly into his presence without experiencing death. Genesis 5:24. Enoch's life serves as a testament to the depth of faith that existed within Seth's lineage. He was not just a believer, he was a living example of what it meant to walk in intimate fellowship with God. His faithfulness stood in stark contrast to the increasing wickedness of Cain's descendants, who had embraced corruption and moral decay. Another key figure in Seth's lineage was Methuselah, known for his extraordinary lifespan. Many biblical scholars believe that Methuselah's name, which can be interpreted as his death shall bring, carries prophetic significance, possibly indicating that the flood of Noah's time would come shortly after his passing. This interpretation further emphasizes the idea that Seth's descendants carried a deep awareness of God's timeline and remained devoted to his will through each generation. However, it was Noah, the great-grandson of Enoch and the 10th generation from Adam through Seth, who would become the ultimate testament to the enduring faith of Seth's lineage. Genesis 6:9 describes Noah as a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. In a world overrun by sin, where violence and corruption had reached their peak, Noah's faithfulness set him apart. He found favor in God's eyes and was chosen to preserve humanity through the great flood. Noah's righteousness did not emerge in isolation. It was the result of generations of faithful teaching, worship, and devotion that had been passed down through Seth's line. His ability to stand firm in the midst of overwhelming wickedness was a direct reflection of the spiritual foundation established by his ancestors. Without the faithfulness of Seth and his descendants, the knowledge of God could have been completely lost amidst the growing corruption of the world. This highlights a profound truth. Righteousness is not just about personal salvation. It is about ensuring that God's truth endures for future generations. Seth's lineage serves as a powerful reminder that faithfulness to God is not only transformative in an individual's life, but also in the destiny of humanity itself. Seth and his descendants faced an immense challenge, preserving their faith in a world that was rapidly falling into corruption. As the population grew, the influence of Cain's lineage became more widespread, and the temptation to conform to the ways of the world was stronger than ever. Cain's descendants built cities, pursued technological advancements, and established cultures centered around self-indulgence, pride, and rebellion against God. Violence and immorality became the norm, and society as a whole drifted further from its creator. In the midst of this growing darkness, Seth's family stood as a beacon of righteousness, committed to upholding the faith that had been entrusted to them. The greatest challenge they faced was not just external opposition, but the subtle danger of assimilation. As interactions between the two lineages increased, many of Seth's descendants were drawn to the material prosperity and pleasures of Cain's world. The temptation to intermarry and adopt their practices was ever present, threatening to dilute the spiritual integrity of Seth's line. Maintaining their distinctiveness required vigilance, strong leadership, and an unwavering commitment to God's commands. Seth and his descendants knew that if they compromised their faith, they risked losing the sacred knowledge of God that had been passed down from Adam and Eve. Despite these challenges, Seth's lineage remained steadfast in their devotion to God. They understood that their faith was not merely a personal belief, but a sacred responsibility, a calling to preserve righteousness in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to God's ways. They continued to teach their children and grandchildren the importance of worship, obedience, and walking in faith, ensuring that the truth of God's promises would not be lost. This commitment to faithfulness allowed them to remain distinct from Cain's descendants, even as the world around them grew darker. The contrast between the two lineages became even more apparent over time. While Cain's descendants pursued worldly success and moral compromise, Seth's family focused on spiritual preservation. They called upon the name of the Lord, gathered in worship, and upheld the values that had been instilled in them since the days of Adam. Their steadfastness ensured that there would always be a remnant of people devoted to God, no matter how widespread sin became. Seth's lineage teaches us an important lesson. Faithfulness to God requires intentionality. It is not enough to simply believe. One must actively resist the influences of a corrupt world and remain dedicated to God's will. In every generation, there will be pressures to conform, to compromise, and to abandon righteousness in favor of comfort and acceptance. However, just as Seth's family remained faithful, despite the challenges they faced, we too are called to stand firm, guarding our faith and passing it down to those who come after us. Seth's lineage played a pivotal role in God's redemptive plan, leading directly to the birth of Jesus Christ. From the moment of Seth's birth, he was appointed as the foundation of a righteous line, one that would remain faithful to God despite the growing corruption in the world. While Cain's descendants pursued their own ambitions, building cities and advancing civilization apart from God, Seth's family focused on preserving the knowledge of the Creator and living in obedience to His commands. This dedication to righteousness ensured that the promise of redemption, given in Genesis 3:15, would not be forgotten but carried forward through the generations. The significance of Seth's lineage becomes evident as we trace his descendants through biblical history. Among them was Noah, a man who walked faithfully with God, Genesis 6:9, and was chosen to preserve humanity through the great flood. Without the foundation of faith that Seth's family had cultivated, Noah's righteousness would not have been possible. His unwavering commitment to God in the face of overwhelming wickedness was a direct result of the values instilled in him by his ancestors. Because of Noah's faithfulness, God spared him and his family, allowing humanity to continue and resetting the course of history. From Noah, the righteous lineage continued through Abraham, whom God called to be the father of many nations. Genesis 17:5. Abraham's faith and obedience marked a new phase in God's plan, as he established a covenant that would ultimately lead to the birth of Jesus Christ. This divine promise, carried through generations, was not merely about a single nation, but about the restoration of all humanity. Through Seth's descendants, God was preserving a people who would serve as the carriers of his covenant, ensuring that his plan for salvation remained intact. Centuries later, the lineage of Seth would culminate in Jesus Christ, the promised Savior who fulfilled God's ultimate plan of redemption. The genealogy in Luke 3:38 explicitly traces Jesus' ancestry back to Seth, emphasizing that the righteous line established through him was divinely chosen to bring forth the Messiah. This connection is profound, illustrating that God's sovereignty and faithfulness span across generations. Even in the midst of human failure, he preserved a remnant who would carry his promises forward. Seth's life and legacy remind us that God's plans are never hindered by the failures of humanity. Despite the sin that filled the world, God ensured that a righteous line would continue a lineage that would eventually lead to the one who would redeem all people. Seth's role in this divine narrative demonstrates the importance of faithfulness, showing that our obedience today can have an impact that reaches far beyond our lifetime, shaping the future in ways we may never fully comprehend. Seth's life offers a timeless lesson on the power of faithfulness, obedience, and perseverance in a world that continually drifts away from God. His story is not just a historical account. It is a testament to how one person's commitment to righteousness can shape generations to come. Unlike his brother Cain, who pursued self-reliance and rebellion, Seth dedicated himself to preserving the knowledge of God and passing it down through his descendants. His influence did not end with his lifetime, but continued through Noah, Abraham, and ultimately Jesus Christ. This legacy teaches us that faith is not just about personal salvation. It is about ensuring that God's truth endures for future generations. One of the most powerful lessons from Seth's life is the importance of standing firm in faith, even when the world is moving in the opposite direction. In Seth's time, humanity was quickly descending into corruption. Cain's lineage had embraced moral decay, violence, and self-glorification, while fewer and fewer people remained devoted to God. Yet Seth and his family remained steadfast, ensuring that worship and obedience to God did not disappear. His life reminds us that spiritual faithfulness requires intentional effort. We must actively choose to walk with God, even when the world around us seeks to pull us away. This message is incredibly relevant today. In our modern world, we see a similar divide. Society often prioritizes success, wealth, and personal ambition over faith and spiritual integrity. Just as Cain's descendants pursued advancements and material prosperity without regard for God, many people today build their lives around careers, status, and achievements while neglecting their spiritual foundation. However, Seth's story teaches us that true fulfillment does not come from worldly success, but from a life devoted to God. The question we must ask ourselves is this: are we living in a way that honors God, or are we slowly being drawn into a culture that values everything but Him? Another lesson we learn from Seth is the power of spiritual legacy. He understood that faith is not meant to be kept to oneself, it must be shared and passed down. Seth's greatest contribution was not just his personal faith, but his role in ensuring that the knowledge of God was preserved for generations. This responsibility falls on us as well. Whether as parents, mentors, or friends, we are called to invest in the faith of others, to teach and model what it means to follow God. Just as Seth's faithfulness paved the way for the coming of Christ, our faithfulness today can impact the lives of those who come after us. In the end, Seth's story is a call to action. It challenges us to rise above the distractions and compromises of the world and live with purpose, knowing that our faith is part of a greater narrative. It reminds us that God is always working through those who remain faithful to Him, no matter how dark the world may seem. Our decisions today shape not only our own future, but the future of those who follow. Just as Seth's faithfulness helped preserve God's plan for salvation, our faithfulness can serve as a guiding light in our families, communities, and the world around us.